Hello, my name is Rebecca Rowland, and this is my psychoeducation video on PTSD and neurobiological impacts of trauma. Learning objectives. So by the end of this video, I hope you'll be able to determine how to identify, define, and describe what PTSD is, understand who can be diagnosed with PTSD and why it develops, understand how trauma affects the brain, and how it relates to the limbic system. So let's get to it. So what you may be asking, what is PTSD? More specifically, let's find out what it stands for. PTSD stands for post-traumatic stress disorder. Let's break it down even further. Post meaning after, traumatic meaning emotionally disturbing or distressing feelings or symptoms, stress meaning a state of mental or emotionally strain or tension, and disorder meaning functional abnormality or disturbance. So this definition I'm about to share with you comes part of the DSM-5 as well as doing some more digging and research of what PTSD is. So the definition I have is PTSD is a disorder that someone could be diagnosed with after a traumatic event that has happened to oneself or someone they know or care about through the means of experiencing, seeing, or learning about. So some traumatic events could be physical or sexual assault, abuse, an accident, a disaster, a terrorist attack, threatened death, serious injury, being kidnapped, human trafficking, etc., etc., etc. So after the traumatic event, if there are elevated, distressing, repetitive symptoms within the first 3 months after trauma, it's a warning sign to seek professional help. So now you may be asking, what are some of these symptoms? And I didn't include this in my presentation, so bear with me as I read some of these for you that came from the DSM-5. Recurrent, involuntary, and intrusive distressing memories. And for children, they may experience the same thing, but instead it might be repetitive play with the reoccurring theme of the aspects of the trauma event that they went through. Distressing dreams. For children, it could be frightening dreams. They could be nightmares. There could be flashbacks that feels like this event of what they went through is reoccurring. There might be intense or prolonged psychological distress or internal or external cues that symbolize or resemble the event. There could be avoidance of effort to avoid the thoughts and feelings, but also there might be an avoidance to people, places, conversations, activities, objects, or situations. There could be negative reactions. There could be inability to remember. That's more for those who might have had a head injury or had alcohol or drugs. There could be negative beliefs. There could be problems with concentration, exaggeration, reckless or irritable behavior, and suicide ideation or possibly even suicide attempts. And again, there's even more symptoms out there. As clinicians may continue to work with these clients, they may come across more symptoms and feelings out there for PTSD. So Who can get PTSD? Anyone, even children, can develop having PTSD. However, everyone experiences it differently. According to the National Institute of Mental Health, they state that PTSD is estimated to affect about 1 in every 3 people who have had a traumatic experience. But it's not clear exactly why some people develop the condition and others don't. It is natural to feel afraid during a traumatic situation, and fear is a part of the body of the fight or flight response, which helps us to avoid or respond to potential danger. People may experience a range of reactions after trauma, and most will recover from their symptoms over time, but then there's others who may experience continually of these feelings, which then could lead to being diagnosed with PTSD. More commonly, with veterans, 7 or 8 of every 100 people will experience PTSD in their lifetime, but as we learned earlier, it's more than just veterans who experience PTSD. So, why does it develop? So, according to Alvarado Parkway Institute Behavioral Health System, they state that it develops because of genetics, possibly. So studies have found that a link between PTSD or other inheritable psych disorders such as depression and schizophrenia could lead to PTSD, as well as in the DSM-5, so I'm going to pull it out for a second, they talk about in here as well, the same as this other institute, that it could be because of genetics. So the DSM-5 says, so this could include female gendered, because it's more commonly in females than it is in males, and younger age at the time of trauma exposure for adults. Certain genotypes may either be protective or increase risk of PTSD after exposure of a traumatic event. So maybe PTSD develops because of genetics. Another reason is maybe the lack of a support system. People who don't have a strong connection with family or friends are more likely to have a stronger physical and emotional reactions to trauma. That is why I believe a lot of people do go seek counseling or go to a therapist, because they don't have anyone to talk to. And so when they go seek a counselor or someone, they can really express what they're feeling and experiencing in life. Another reason why it could be developed is because of pre-existing mental health conditions. So having another mental health problem, such as anxiety, depression, or maybe a history of substance abuse, could elevate the risk of developing PTSD. And the last one is through traumatic events. So a PTSD diagnosis requires exposure to a traumatic event, either indirect or firsthand, but some traumas carry a higher risk of developing PTSD than others, especially those who are extreme or life-threatening. Alrighty, this is the second part of the psychoeducational video, where I will now be talking about the neurobiological impacts on trauma. I will, however, not be talking about all the specific parts of the brain and how they react to trauma. I apologize, my dog is dreading for attention right now. But anyways, I am more focused on the limbic system. And even in this graph that I have below, I will not even be talking about all the different parts Not because they're not important when it comes to trauma, but just because there are other parts of the limbic system that have more of a bigger role when it comes to trauma. But also, the things that I will be sharing come a lot from Dr. Russ Harris. He does a better job at explaining how trauma affects the brain and different parts of the brain as a lot better than I can. So I would recommend watching his videos if you haven't yet. So anyways, let's get to it. Alright, so as you can see here and here, this is the limbic system. As stated before, this is a big part of where trauma comes from and reacts to the different parts of our brain. So limbic system is also known as the mammalian brain. Apologize if I said that wrong. And it also is called the emotional, the behavioral, and the motivational side of our brain. So as you can see in this picture, the brain stem is right here and the limbic system kind of sits right above it. So the very first thing when it comes to trauma, the very first thing to receive all of the action is the thalamus, right in this area. So as Dr. Russ says, it's the data analysis. It's putting all together this information through the external and internal world, using our 5 senses. So it's gathering all of this data, it's noticing through our senses, kind of like warning different parts of our body that maybe something's abnormal. But then that information goes into 2 different directions, but the first, not first, because they go at the same time, but the faster route goes to the amygdala. So this is the emergency part of our brain, and so it's collecting these senses, and the thalamus is sending this information to the amygdala, and the amygdala is saying, oh my goodness, there's something wrong, this is abnormal, there's a threat, and it sends off this alarm throughout our whole body, indicating that we are in danger. Okay, so the amygdala then sends this information to the security guard, as Dr. Russ says, and that's our sympathetic nervous system. So this is not in the presentation, but this information that's sent to the sympathetic nervous system, it's then telling our bodies, do we take cover, do we shoot, as in do we fight, flight, freeze, drop? What are we going to do to protect ourselves in this situation, in this traumatic event? So again, let's go back to the thalamus, because it doesn't only send information here, but it also sends information to, as I don't know how this picture popped up quite quickly, so but the prefrontal cortex. Okay, so this is kind of like the mission control. So it's gathering this data, it's centered right above our eyes, and it is the part of the brain where we're mindful and we're more aware and we're trying to make the decision, do we actually need to take action or do we actually not? Is it an actual threat or is it a perceived threat? Okay. Trying to figure out if you're okay or not. So the amygdala also sends information to the prefrontal cortex, but this route is a little bit slower. But going back to the thalamus, and this is where I'm kind of concluding, okay? And again, I didn't get to other parts of the brain, even though a lot of it does have a play in trauma. But what happens overall is that the thalamus is sending the wrong, inaccurate data to the amygdala. Oh, I did not mean to write on that. I meant to do this. Yeah. So let me say that again. The thalamus is sending wrong, inaccurate data to the amygdala. Okay, and from the amygdala is freaking out. It's telling your whole body that there's something wrong, that tells your nervous system how you need to respond to trauma. Okay, and so from that, then it kind of stems all these symptoms that I mentioned earlier with PTSD, and not, oh, you would be diagnosed with PTSD is not what I'm saying if you're experiencing trauma, because trauma stems from other things, but kind of where symptoms start. Anger, being upset, depressed, tired, having flashbacks, not wanting to avoid, certain situations and people, and suicide, and all these other things that could lead to trauma. So I hope that makes sense. Again, I'm not the best at explaining it, but thanks for listening. And in the next page of my presentation are all the resources I used for my psychoeducation video. So thanks for watching.